All right, we are recording live.
This is legendary here.
Man,
My man,
what's good?
my man. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your energy. Thank you for being a part of this journey. I'm glad that I can do this with my brother.
Yes.
And, we get the opportunity to share something that we feel it's highly important and valuable. Highly important and valuable. Thank you for joining us.
For sure. What are we here for? What is our title? What is the name? What should people remember as they listen to us?
And so, starting out, my name is Phil and
Will.
And we are here to talk with you guys and to join you guys in, talking about a feeling of an era of music, of culture that shaped the people not only that we are today, but that many of you are and that the world is today. And so we're really excited about this opportunity to be here and to share what we call from the head table, the golden era. The golden era is a time period within American history where we say it's really from around 1980 to around 2000, where the essence of Black culture, American culture, was such that it changed and shifted the way that the world operated, the way that the world worked forever. And we're still living under the impact of that era. And so we're excited to talk to you every week about just a litany, just a number of different things that, are related to this era. And we, excited that you join us every week here.
And we thank you for being part of the journey. There's a lot of choices of things to fill your time up. So we appreciate you being a part of this big journey. You are the community that informs what we talk about. And we want to get into it because the one thing about the era, the one thing about that 80s to 2000 era was that people were free. Yes. Free to speak their mind, free to be culturally creative, free to explore things that had never been explored before. When you think about the output of music, film, TV, fashion, all of it was pushing the boundaries that previously existed. None of it was conforming, right?
Absolutely.
Even the things that may not have been as in your face as a Spike Lee or in your face as a Public Enemy or in your face as in Living Color or whatever, everything that came out from R&B music to, the grimiest of hip hop, it all was pushing it in a way that the decades before that sounded so much different. Yeah. And it just felt like a completely comfortable time to be free, right? You didn't feel any apprehension or, cultural oppression that I can't be my true self, right? Yeah. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. But one thing you can say is that pretty much everybody was authentic.
Yeah. It was, it's interesting being in 2025, heading into 2026 at a time where I think we all would agree authenticity is at a premium, right? Like it's very difficult to find it on multiple levels.
Anywhere.
And it evolves, right?
Yeah.
It changes, right? Our definition of authenticity has changed. Let's be honest, right? Like people are saying, I won't even go there, but additional body parts and different things is, that there are, once again, those are forms of expression, and we don't, by no means here at the head table, denounce those or talk against it. But we also want to be honest about, are those extensions of, who you are as a person, or, at times is it something that, let me not say who you are as a person. That doesn't, we'll edit this, but, what we want to talk about is how that time period really defined the authentic nature of the people that we are today, right? Because as you think about who are the purveyors of culture going forward, you're really talking about the younger generation, but our ideas and our perspectives are also teaching them, right, and educating 100%. Them. Yeah. So it's literally a continuation, and what we hope is a continuation of what has come before us. And so we're glad to be a part of that really circle, right?
You know what? That makes me think about something, and it's interesting, right? So this talks about the culture and the era in the 80s leading up into the 90s. There was so much backlash on sampling, right? Initially, right? Just the idea of like someone, you know, hip hop. You know, there were the people who embraced it, right? The George Clintons and the James Browns and those people like who like let hip hop run with their music, right? And it created, you know, so many masterpieces. But there was just outside even the artists or the older artists, just society and just the industry in general. Like at first, they're just going in there taking people's music and stealing it, right? Yeah. Even all the way up until if you think like when Puff came out with Mary J. Blige, right? Like that was a knock. Like, oh man, you know, they're just sampling. She's singing over these songs that already been out, these R&B songs. But to your point about Continuum, the reason I bring it up is I just thought about as you were talking, like that helped.
Yeah.
Our generation learn about those artists.
Yeah.
That was the thing that was missing. That was the piece that no one who was either older or outside of the culture really understood, is that for people like us, you know, that whole era helped us learn about jazz artists, right? Help us learn about, you know, old soul artists. Like you'd be like, what is this? Like, because back then you would actually read and see like where this stuff came from, and it helped us to understand that continuum, right? And so when we moved away from sampling, actually, it kind of put this like barrier, which probably started happening as you got out the 2000s. Like Kanye was kind of the last person to really come on the scene and really, really like embrace sampling at a high level. But like that was a undercurrent to the era, was that like it was educating us too, right? So we talk about what are the characteristics. That was a characteristic that came through sampling, almost like unknowingly. Like we were sampling because we were just trying to make dope music, right? And make a dope beat. But like at the end of the day, it was educating us and keeping jazz, blues, R&B all going into
your nervous system.
Yeah.
Really, when you think about it, right? It's, you know, that's what music does. That's why we, you know, it has such an impact on us the way that it does, because it literally goes into your nervous system. So, you know, the way it impacts the way you think, the way you speak, the way you move, right? All of those things are impacted by music. And so when you talk about that continuum, it makes me think about the movie Sinners, right?
Yeah, that was in my back of my mind. Right? Yeah.
Everyone's favorite part, where you saw the continuum of the music, but specifically, and the culture, the dress, all of that was a part of that scene. But speaking specifically about the sounds, right? Man, you think about, you know, that was a time period where, like you said, it was seen as, back to what we were saying about authenticity, there was a question of whether it was authentic because you were using someone else's music, right? Was that authentic?
Yeah.
And once again, we can argue, right? We could say, for our parents, they look at that music like it's not authentic. Yeah. So we have to be careful when we're talking about the new music. It's not authentic because they don't use this and that. Well, in their world, you know what I mean? It is authentic.
And even artists at the time, like one of my favorite artists, Prince. You know, Prince didn't let people sample his music, right? Yeah. He was very like much about instrumentation and I mean and everything like that. And I remember, you know, I was watching some interview of him talking about when Alicia Keys called about using How You Don't Call Me Anymore, right? So, but he like, because she's an artist, she's
right. He let her do it.
He let her do it, right? So you got to be a true artist in his eyes to get it. So there were people, like I said, not even just our parents, but even people who were in the industry at that time who we idolized, who were very like conscious about like, I don't know if this is really, you know, about it, right? Or they would make them pay dearly, like what's the song? Peter Guns, Lord Trigger Peter Guns, like how they stole that Steely Dan sample and they didn't get it cleared, and they made them. I mean, I don't even know if they even made it off of the song, right?
They made because $20. One of the biggest songs of
ever.
Hip Hop Golden
They play it now in probably stadiums, right? But nah, they don't. Steely Dan
made $20 off of it.
So yeah, you're right. There were a lot of people, who didn't believe it was authentic.
So we're interested to know you guys' thoughts, right? Is when we talk about the continuum of Black culture, we want to stop right here, pause for a second, and give you an opportunity to, you know, go in the comment section and tell us, is the continuum or pieces of the continuum of music, was that authentic to sample beats, right? To sample instrumentation, to sample things from the previous generations, or was, you know, did you think that it wasn't considered artistry? right? For the new generation, what do you guys think about when you hear samples that, once again, nowadays you don't hear it as much, but back then it was a part of hip hop. It's all we knew, right? So we're interested to get you guys' feedback on that. Continuing the conversation around.
One more thing though on authenticity before you move off of that, I was gonna say, as you do make those comments, think about it also outside of the landscape of just music, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people were trying to say like, oh, Eddie Murphy's trying to be like Richard Pryor, right?
Yeah,
So he's coming up, right? And he's like, he has a similar style, and they're trying, and then it continued from there with Chris and Eddie. Like, so it's always this idea of like, are we biting? Are the new generation? Are we taking from the previous generation too much that people think we're not authentic and we're not creating a quote unquote new voice, right? So it happened in music, it happened in all aspects of the culture. I mean, even when you think about fashion at the time and like all those fashion brands that were coming out, in the late 80s, early 90s, it was like, did people really feel like that was authentic? Were they taken from, the polos and all these other people trying to make our own thing, or were we creating something actually new? So it applied to everything that was coming back to our earlier point. That whole era is defined by pushing boundaries, and when we were pushing boundaries at that time, there was a lot of criticism on, is this actually something new, or are these people just recycling ideas and claiming as their own? So comment if you feel if you feel like we're not talking about that enough, let us know. But also, I think there's also should be the angle of, are we on point? Like, are we right in assuming that by taking from these different genres and eras, it created something brand new that created what we now define as the golden era?
And it's also, when you think about continuity, is it possible that, when people say they created something new, is that even a real thing? Because the reality is we all have been impacted by
from everything.
Exactly. Even when you're not aware of it. Right. Exactly. Subconsciously, you're pulling from it. And here's the thing. It doesn't have to be a physical, I see a table, therefore I want to make another table like it. It literally is DNA, right? It's subconscious. Once again, central nervous system, all of that is impacted by experiences from the past, ancestors, all of those things. So the question then becomes, is it worth even having a conversation or argument about, what's new, what's real, what's fake, or accepting and embracing every element of it, recognizing that it all plays a part in the full experience. You know what I mean? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm always going to lean on the idea that we're all always pulling from all sorts of energy all the time, all of us, right? Whether you're an artist in that era or just today in 2025. So I'm always going to lean on the idea that, whether it's, like you said, tangible or not, we're always drawing from something else, and that drawing is what allows culture to be built, right? I mean, I don't think it's new. It's not new to the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. That's just from the beginning of time. Like, that's how, there are things that we say in American culture, lexicon, things that we say today that derive from other countries, other, centuries ago that we use day and day and don't even understand the origins of it. So everything, language is a part of culture. Hip hop, the music, the lyricism part of it, obviously, is a part of language. So if you're dealing with anything dealing with language, if you just want to talk about the music element of it, it's definitely pulling from everything else. So it's impossible to say, where does it begin, where does it end, what's authentic, what's not authentic. You're gonna be on a infinite, loop if you try to cut it apart. So that's why I just think, my personal view is that we had never seen, and I think one thing that defines the era as well is we've just never seen young Black and brown people in mass create a global movement like hip hop. There's no comparison to that in the history of time, right? So I think that is why it caused so much sort of concern, questioning, what is this? Because we had never seen youth culture dominate. It's usually the older culture. If you think about TV and movies and music, anything you think about, with the exception of, there's always the exceptions, right? There's always the young upstart that comes up and does something new. But I'm talking about as a movement, we had never seen anything like that before. And so I think people just didn't know what to make of this new thing that wasn't just music. It wasn't just a song here. It wasn't just the Sugar Hill Gang and the couple of songs that came after, Melly Mel and this and that. It was song, artists, fashion, Adidas, tracksuits, leather coats, this, that, and the third. Like, I mean, it was a movement that went, the Timbs and just everything that came out of it. It's like, it was not just like, oh, this is just a couple people making some songs. This is like a whole era. And that was just when it was coming out of New York. Just imagine how they felt when it started spreading beyond that as we got into the 90s, and then music's coming out from all over the country. So I just think that, to get back to the original question, yeah, I'm always about the idea that, we're always drawing and pulling from energy, from everything, and that it's almost impossible to start cutting and splicing. I just think that the movement of hip hop was so crazy and new and young people, and it was nobody knew what to do with it. So to take a detour for a quick second, when you think about that though, when you think about authenticity and you think about freedom, like we talked about, what comes to mind? Not even just in music, like when you think about it, like just to set the stage for because I want people who may not be familiar with, we have young artists, young creators, just young people who tune in and listen, right, or watch, that may not know what types of pieces of culture we're talking about. So when we say freedom, when we say freedom, when we say, pushing the genre, when we say authenticity, movie, film, TV, artists, music, like what's a couple of things that just pops in your mind when I say those words, when you think about that era? Just to set the stage of the types of things we're talking about.
I was just gonna say, everything that you described, even I would take it even beyond hip hop, right? Like, I think it's important that when we talk about the head table, that we talk about, once again, where culture resides, where the culture resides. We're really talking about the blending of all of that, right? So like you say, it's not just hip hop. We recognize hip hop. It could almost arguably be the overarching piece to the culture. It could be the equal, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, we recognize that, there are some things within TV, film, all of that may not necessarily be considered hip hop, or they were trying to do something different, but it still was within the culture, right? And the culture was, when you think of defining characteristics, and I'm gonna get to your question in a second, but I wanted to briefly talk about the defining characteristics, and it kind of does answer your question, right, of the culture, right? So what were some of the like vital pieces and some of the distinct characteristics of that time period and the culture, right? Because we know Black culture or Black American culture, whatever, existed way before this, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But what was so unique about this time period, and that's where the head table comes in, because the head table, the idea, the concept is, obviously we're talking about the golden era, we're focusing on the golden era, but it's really about being purveyors and conveyors of Black culture, Black American culture within, not only this country, but the world, and recognizing that this is the place where you come to get information. It's the place where you come to connect, right? It's the place where you come to talk about the past and to inform your present and your future. So the head table is typically a place where, let's say influential people sit, right? So we want to be a part of the influence when it comes to how we talk about the golden era and its impact on, society and the world. So, for me, it's, to answer your question, I think some of those characteristics are, coming out of Vietnam, right? Coming out of the blaxploitation era, coming out of different movements that had already taken place that had impacted heroin, right? Heroin was flooded into the Black community. So when you think about it, it was a time period where there was a lot of angst, there was a lot of worry, there was a lot of our fathers and uncles coming home from Vietnam, having served and having, nowhere to go to express themselves. And then, on top of the anxiety and fear and everything else they were dealing with, now we get flooded with a substance that has this power, and causes people, and causes an addiction, which causes more of our men to leave the homes, right? Yep. More of our men are getting locked up. More, and on top of flooding the community, which we couldn't help, that was put upon us. Now you're giving us addiction, but on top of it, you're also changing the laws to where, one strike or two strikes, whatever, now, you may be gone for life. So these were some of the impacts that influenced the mindset, right? of the men and women that were creating this music, right? So when you listen to an Anita Baker, right, and you listen to, a Janet Jackson in the, early and mid 80s, you're listening to, once again, a continuum of the hurt and the angst of what she was experiencing in Detroit, right? What Janet, of course, moved out of Gary really early, but, I don't know if we can talk about Janet in the hood.
But the through line of her parents, though, I mean,
yeah, exactly. Joe Jackson, right?
Brothers,
You think about his strong hand, right? Where did that come from, right? We were all influenced by men and women of our previous generations and the experiences that they had. And that's what made this so unique. It was also a time when television was beginning to take over. Yeah. Television wasn't normal in the 60s and 70s, right? You were almost considered rich or, well off if you had one, especially a decent one. Now you're getting into the time period in the 80s where you have more televisions, you have more access to it, you have more access to music, right? You have more access to radios, and we're walking around with the big radios, and all those different things are taking place. And so we're consistently hearing and being exposed to this music, this culture. All of these things began to take shape during the 80s, right? The early 80s. Michael Jackson, we talked about before, becomes a global phenomenon, right? When you think about black culture prior to that, it was, relegated to the jazz artists and other people that were going to Europe and other parts of the world, but you didn't see them on television, right? You didn't, if you were, you saw Nat King Cole, you saw, Soul Train had already started, but those were just, very small things compared to when Michael Jackson made Thriller, and it became this global phenomenon, and it was shown on MTV, right? So there were so many things that began to take place and were unique about this time period that created this amazing tapestry of music, film, all these different things that began to, kind of take shape during that time period. What were some other things that come to your mind about the uniqueness of the productivity of that time period?
Yeah, I mean, I think technology is a big through line. You talked about it with TV. You talked about it with like the movement of music just being consumed in closed places.
Yeah.
Right, where it's like I'm only listening to it in my car, or I'm listening to it, in the house, right?
Yeah,
Which more people music. Now you got, like you said, the radios, but then those even shrink into like the Walkmans, right?
Absolutely.
So now people literally can listen to music all day. That never happened, right? Like you could only go to a club
at the house, right?
or a house. It was a closed space.
The 8-track in the car.
A closed space, bro. So like, I mean, you had to go to the club. It was a necessity for you to go to some place to listen to music. Now with the advent of technology, you could just go wherever, right? So now more music can be consumed.
Yeah.
Now people can get even closer to artists than they were before, because now they're constantly listening to them instead of it just being this almost like a movie moment where it's like I got to go somewhere to see it, right?
Right.
The other thing from a technology perspective, outside of TV and all of that, is the way we made music, right? So like the studio set, even though obviously it continues to evolve, and that's one defining trait of the golden era, is like constantly from the 80s all the way up to the 2000s, the technology continued to improve how music was made and distributed, right? So you think about it, prior to the 80s, there really wasn't like a way for you to even think about making music without having a full band, without having like hiring musicians. And so, I mean, obviously you had to be either a really good musician or know a lot of musicians to even have a chance to make music back in the 70s and anytime before that. You get into the mid 80s with hip hop, right? They're getting these samplers, right? And they're not, the best of the best that they evolved to be, but like they're at least in a place where these 4 tracks and these samplers, they could actually make music, right? At home or in a studio, really small, just a couple of, people, and they could actually create what ended up being like LL Cool J's music or Run DMC's music or whomever else. So the idea of like being able to, and that continued like rapid fire from that point forward all the way up to the, these like SP1200s and ASR10, like all these samplers, it just continued to get better and better and better. So the technology is a huge part of what defines that era, right? That's so different from any time prior to that. Like music was pretty much made the same way most of the 50s, 60s, 70s, right? It was the same, process. All of that shifted, once we got into the 80s and 90s. And then that opened up the door for youth because now I don't have to be a perfect musician. I don't have to know a whole bunch of musicians. I just need to understand how to chop and sample this music and put it together in a way and find somebody to rap over it. And that's part of what, the defining characteristics of hip hop culture. Yeah. And that's just in hip hop. That doesn't even get into camcorders, right? You never had camcorders before the 80s and 90s, right? So now you got people like the Spike Lees who got a camera from his friend, right? When he was at home one summer from Morehouse. And that camera changed his life, right? Like him being able to shoot on something mobile that was inexpensive allowed him to become a filmmaker that we know today. So that was something that you could never think about doing before then, right? Walking around with your own camera in your hand, being able to film. Yeah, some rich people obviously early on had that, right? But like for the most part, especially people from the cultures we're talking about, they didn't either, right? So you think about all of those aspects, right? And you can keep going on, you can hit every aspect of culture at the time. Obviously, even with TV, the ability for us to record TV, right? You can record moments and then replay them back, right? When the VCRs came out, right? The idea of you being able to like relive moments. It gets kind of back to the whole thing about having portable music. You're able to relive these moments. So now you're getting even close. That's why Michael became so big, is because we could listen to Michael all day. We could watch him. We could record the 25th Motown thing or whatever, and watch him do the moonwalk 100 times, or record Thriller and watch Thriller like of the video over and over again. Like you could never do that before with artists, to get that close to them. So the technology piece, it would be, and we're not even going to get into, and we will obviously get into just what the late 90s brought with like the internet and streaming and file sharing. It just goes to a whole nother level after that. But that's a defining, from the 80s all the way to 2000, technology, even going from like you said earlier, album to the 8-track. Then now we got cassettes, right, which are mobile. Then we get the CDs in the 90s, right? So continuing to evolve the technology, the sound gets better. We can play it at a fidelity that we could never hear before, right? So all of those things to me, have a huge impact on how that era is so powerful versus any other era, because the advancements in culture and the technology that impacts culture was unlimited during that time.
Let's also talk about the zeitgeist. Is that how you pronounce it? Zeitgeist. I've heard it pronounced multiple ways.
Man, you ain't never heard of no zeitgeist. Who said the zeitgeist? Nobody said no zeitgeist.
Did I make that up? Hey, what were the defining characteristics, of that time period as it relates to the content, right? The subject matter of the music, of the movies, right? Of the fashion, all the different things that make up this culture, right? That we love so much, that we're all a part of, that we're excited to talk about. What were some of the things about 1980 to 2000? We recognize that that's a generation, that's an era. So we won't be able to, while there's a through line, there's a lot of variation too, right? And a lot of change and evolution. We recognize that. But if we could kind of summarize those 20 years, right? What were some of the things that were going on mentally within the Black culture?
That's a good question.
And once again, let's start with crack, right? Let's start with the drug. We talked about heroin earlier, right?
And that was kind of what I was getting to, the question I asked you earlier about the defining things and what comes to mind, because you can't think about that time period. You kind of hinted a little bit on heroin, but like you can't think about that time period when hip hop is at its sort of peak in that time, and it's starting to go to like a new level, without talking about the impact of drugs, right?
Yeah.
And it's like good, bad, or otherwise.
And
like
the war on our communities.
Yeah, good, bad, or otherwise. Like it was a defining moment of all of it, right? Because it was talked about in the music from day one. It was talked about as a way that some of those young men were getting out of the community, right? And they were basically like using hip hop as a way to get away from it on some level. The impact that it was having on their households, right? Yeah. And so they're talking about through that angle. Then you have even the war, to your point on it, that creates a group like NWA, right? Because the level of police hostility that was happening because of the war on drugs created this angst that results in, Straight Outta Compton and things like that came out that were literally a reflection of, as you saw, if anybody saw the movie again that came out, you just saw what they were going just to try to record music, right? So, and that's just the musical element. We're not even gonna get into like the glorification of it sometimes. Not glorification, but like the Hollywood angle of it that came with like the New Jack City movie and things like that. That also like showcased the ills of it too. And you even saw it come in Spike Lee's, like when you think about movies that weren't necessarily about crack, right, in that era, but like Jungle Fever, like there was a lot of undertones of what crack was doing to the community in that movie, even though that wasn't the main subject matter of the movie. So,
alcoholism, all of it.
So to your point, it's anything that you were witnessing during that time period, whether it was the effects on the individuals, their families, the household, the policing that came because of it, the laws that were being, impacting those black men and women at a high level, destruction of like, the normalcy of childhood, right? Because like, I don't know about you, but if you just put it on a personal level, like, I mean, there was a lot of craziness that you were witnessing as a kid that never was a part of your innocence, before that era, right? Like you were being exposed to crack vials and just crazy things that you was eating, no matter what your socioeconomic, if you were part of the culture, you were someone in your family, you were going to your grandmother's house, your aunt's house, your cousin's house, you were put into that world somewhere in your life. That's how impactful it was, that you couldn't escape
widespread, it. There was no way around it. And it influenced the creativity during that time period. You know what I mean? And that's really what I want you guys to think about too, because ultimately we're trying to bring this home where all of us can sit back and think about how these influences and how these things during this era impacted us, right? Mentally, physically, emotionally, financially, because many of us are still living out some of these impacts, right? And we want to make sure that one of the beautiful things about this time period was how it created people that were determined not to allow them and their families to experience the same thing during that time, right? Because it was such a difficult time, because we were coming off of Vietnam and crack and so many different things that it impacted the black community. Many of us made internal decisions that we would never live in those type communities. We would never be a part of those types of experience, things like that. But we also now recognize that at times, maybe we moved a little too far outside of our communities. Maybe we allowed gentrification and other things to start to come in. Maybe we allowed the expansion and globalization of music and commercialization of different things that were specific to our culture, right? And our community to now be hijacked and used and put into other communities and, for other people to use it. So this is really what the Head Table is about. This is a safe space for us to have real conversations where we talk about and dissect, but also be able to use that as we go forward, right? We want to inform the current, the present, and, prepare for the future. So, yes, I think, I want to transition a little bit to some of the, amazing, actually, I want to continue talking about what you brought up, which I think was critical, because for many of us, at this age now, we were children during that time period, right? So you talked about the impact on children and the youth culture. Let's talk about some of the things that we did during that time and things we were exposed to, but we saw it as fun, right? We talked about some of the challenges, right? Seeing, parents and grandparents on alcohol and drugs and different ways that we were impacted. But guys, y'all know we had so much fun, right? We were just talking earlier off camera about the fact that we now have to put our children, we have to be intentional putting our children into organizations and different things that back in the day, it was just natural that you kind of develop those things organically, just living in your community. You go outside, before you know it, you got 5 friends, you know what I mean? And y'all get together every day and ride bikes and watch television and play video games, play ball. Yeah. That's not happening anymore. So not, at that level. So, what are some of the things that you remember as a child that made, I remember stuff real quick, like BMX bikes, right? Like BMX is...
That's part of the culture too. That showed up in movies, right?
Yes,
you think about like Goonies, like you think about these movies that came out that time period, like the kids riding their bikes and discover. It's so funny, like, you look at Stranger Things now and everybody's like, Stranger Things is a big deal. But it's like the idea around like kids explore, like the whole concept, man, the idea of kids exploring and getting together, and like you said, the bikes were like our transportation. That's how we got from point A to point B. Wasn't no electric scooters, electric bikes. It was all about those BMX bikes, and you wanted to get the ones with the handlebars.
With the white spokes.
It had the little pegs on it. You could stand on the front of your bike or all that. No, that's a good
skateboarding.
That's a good skateboard culture was big. That's a whole separate conversation about how big skateboarding was to black communities that people don't talk a lot about. I mean, Skateboard P, obviously, Pharrell talks about it, but yeah,
it was y'all in the comments talk about it. What was? I mean, you guys remember? Drinking from the water fountain. I'm not water fountain.
I would say the hose.
The hose. You know what I mean? Like and once again, those things we look back at, and it's like it was just things we did. But in many ways, those were ways to connect. Those were ways to, generate camaraderie and familiarity, friendship, right? You fought all the time, right? Like it was normal for you to fight your friends, especially boys. Maybe the ladies, y'all tell us, maybe y'all weren't fighting as much, but boys, we had to fight. You know what I mean?
The girls was part of it too,
right? Playing house, you know what I mean? And it's funny because I always tell people I hated playing house. It was just so lame to me, but I look back at it now and I'm just like, in many ways, it's funny you think about like they talk about this generation's failure to launch, right? Like, they stay with their parents till they 50 years old, right?
I mean, if they could,
and they're comfortable with that, right? Like they want
no shame.
Right, I'm saying it's not like, back in the day, that was shame. Bro, why is your son still living at 50, right? But now it's like, that's normal, but the failure to launch. But you think back to house, that in many ways we were being trained, you know what I mean, and how to prepare, to be mature. And I wasn't feeling that at all.
That's what I'm saying.
I'm the dad and you're the mother, man. I wasn't feeling none of that. Get them dolls out of here, man. I'm trying to go. I'm trying to be in these streets.
You're right.
Hey, let me get on my BMX.
And that's the thing, that you be on your bike. You could be on your bike forever. Your parents don't even know where you're at. That's the thing you have to realize. Parents didn't know. They could now. Most people, they have some way to communicate with their child, phone, watches, whatever, right? But like back then, literally, if you were gone from the house, your parents had no idea where you were at.
What did that mean? You had to know the streets. You had to understand how to navigate life.
And there wasn't a concern though, right? Like now you would be super concerned if your kids were
by what time?
Yeah, by lights, the lights go up.
That was it.
Yeah, the lights go up. That was it. I don't know where you at, but
right, there was no. I think about
because that's when the danger's gonna start. The danger gonna start when the lights come on. So if you back before
in reality, the danger's happening all day. You just didn't tell your parents.
You ain't know.
Right.
So much
didn't
trust.
Tell your parents.
But it was trust in society too, right? It wasn't just trust in you as a kid. It was trust that I could just throw my kid out there. But that's what teaches you how to navigate. Man, there were times, bro, like when I remember they would have like where I lived at, they were still building like neighborhoods, like so where I was at had been settled, but then like if you go like a little bit further away, like maybe like 10 to 15 minutes away, it was still like a lot of like land and lots, and it all looked the same because there were some houses being built, some not. It was just like a new area, right? So, us obviously kids, right? It's like all that mud and hills. We riding our bikes and this is fun, right? So we would go do that. But it's like, at this point, 20, maybe 25 minutes away from the house. Yeah. So as it would start to get close to get dark, I'd be lost.
Boy,
right? Like we be looking at each other like, man, how do we get over here? Because now we done drove you.
Where we at?
You ain't thinking like, oh, let's recount our steps. We ain't got no phone to take pictures of where we at. We just riding. So we would be like, we'd have to huddle up and like put our mind together, like how the hell we gonna get back home? Because we don't get back home, we gonna get in trouble. So my point is, what did that teach you though, right? As a kid, like early to be able to like handle pressure, think logically, like just basic stuff that kids not have no clue. If they got lost, the first thing they'll do is like, Daddy, wherever I at, right? Like, or come get me, right?
Think
it's not gonna
GPS,
be
just the GPS.
Oh, just having maps in general.
And ladies, I'm gonna mess with y'all because most of y'all know most women tell you what is it? The sense of direction. I have no sense of direction, right? But once again, that's almost not true because in reality, you had to, as in our generation, there's no excuse for somebody 35 up to say they have no sense of direction.
There was nothing to lean on.
You were navigating.
It was all about
unless you were in the house all day, which was rare.
Right.
You had to navigate your neighborhood and you had to figure out how to get back. Right.
Go to landmarks to remember.
Right.
Like,
exactly.
Okay, this
all of that.
Corner. Yeah. That was crazy.
So
man.
yeah, I mean, it was such a fun time. And I say that in the context of thinking about all the, like you say, this tapestry, right? This beautiful tapestry of this time period. What were the important pieces to it? What were the things that, we can remember that caused us to really, like we talked about earlier, to go back to that feeling? What was the feeling, right? I remember, and I'm born in Cleveland, Ohio, right? And so my early years up until 8 years of age were just filled with Luther Vandross albums, waking up in the morning, we had chores, right? That was normal. And
especially on the
there
weekends,
was no doing chores without hearing Luther, right? There was no doing chores without hearing LTD, right? And George Benson and, you name it, the Doobie Brothers, it didn't matter. My father was playing it. His albums were in this red bin. He had this big bin, I don't know if you remember, you push it and then it opens and you put your albums in it and all of that. I mean, and we would literally just sit there and listen to music the entire weekend, right? And you just remember Luther's voice, right? The beautiful, soulful, pure, beautiful voice and the melodies, right? From his instrumental. From his, partners like, what's his name, Miller, his musician.
Marcus Miller.
Marcus Miller. And you think about what did that do to your mindset as a kid? It was calming, right? It was calming, right? It made you feel safe. It made you feel secure. Once again, we recognize the backdrop was crack. The backdrop was violence, more violence than we ever experienced in black communities. The backdrop was people, losing their houses and all these different things. But at the same time, we had created this beautiful culture that made us feel safe, right? We could go in the house and watch The Cosby Show, right? We could watch and live in, a different world that made you, think about what was it like to go to college and to be, a part of this historically black college, which we all wanted to go to. That didn't exist.
Wearing the shirts
right. What was, once again, we want to talk about the psychology, right, of us and people from that time period because of these things that we're talking about, these cultural influences. So you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was about to say, so that's a good point about the characteristics of the time. And so this is something to definitely debate, right? And I'm up for debate. So when you talk about Luther, right, who, like you said, brilliance. And so there's a whole conversation about just the music of the time and how it made you feel, right? And just all of those artists, even like you said, stepping a little bit even back into the late 70s, like you mentioned, like the Doobie Brothers, you mentioned like all of the artists that were coming out at that time and just the incredible music and just the artistry and the pureness and the lyricism was just, it takes you somewhere. Like, it's not just like I'm listening to it. You could just dance to a lot of stuff, but also, like you said, it transformed you. And like you got to think that's all we were listening to because again, there wasn't a lot of extra entertainment. We didn't have our individual devices to just stream music on Spotify, right? Like we had to collectively as a household, like right now, like you can kind of separate out. Nah, we all listened to the same thing and it was always on in black households as a coping mechanism. That's a separate conversation of how we use music to get through from day one. But the point I wanted to bring up and the debate I wanted to bring up is the art at the time, especially in the 80s, and it flipped in the 90s when hip hop took off as a skyrocket, and it might be why it was successful. The music, the imagery you saw, you think about Ebony and Jet magazines, you think about, like you said, the Cosby Show coming out in the 80s, you think about the music, the George Bensons, like you mentioned, the Anita Bakers even, right? Even how Whitney Houston was presented, you think about Luther Vandross, everything was perfection. Everything was this black, like, culture. Even when you think about the early days of like
album covers, man.
Album covers and just stuff I love. It was about like this image. Like you think about the videos, like people would be in suits in videos, right? Like they would be dressed up. There was the Jerry curl era. Yeah. We can talk about what that did. But this whole idea of like beautifying and presenting this almost stoic, great image of blackness versus the reality that was going on outside, right? Because that was knocking on the door. That's when you get the, Public Enemies, the NWAs and all that, Ice Cubes, all that comes out of like, hey, we forget all that. We put on these white t-shirts. We about to tell you what's really going on. But before that happened, there was a concerted effort across all imagery of blackness. Like, hey, this is what we want. It's an aspirational, like you said, the Cosby Show, the Huxtable. It's this aspirational, like, great image of us and what we want us to be. Was that great in the sense that it allowed a generation to aspire for that, or was it detrimental? Because there was something that you pointed out, knocking on the door that was impacting everybody, that eventually broke through. That was a completely different view of what was really going on in black communities all over. So what do you think? Was it aspirational and informative and helpful, or was it detrimental in some way because it wasn't really painting the full or maybe even honest view at times of like where black America, and Michael's at the top of that. Like Michael's image was, this like aspirational, perfect, So how do you feel about that? Or how do you feel that
I think it was appropriate. Yeah, I think it was appropriate for that time. You know what I mean? It was what we needed. Right, I feel like it was what we needed because coming out of the 70s where the aesthetic was different, right? We were pimps, we were hoes.
The blaxploitation
hustlers,
at the end of the 70s,
what I mean? All of those things were a part of the black experience. And even that we can argue was necessary, right, during that time. Because even with what some would consider the negativity of that blaxploitation time period, it was also us saying, it was going against, it was revolution. You know what I mean? It was going against the traditional way of doing things. It was going against, quote unquote, the man, the white man, all of that, right?
Yeah, because you think about, Richard Roundtree and Pam Grier and all of that. Yeah, the Foxy Brown, the Shaft and all that. And we had never seen anything like that before. It was imagery that
it was necessary.
That was definitely revolutionary for sure.
So I think it was necessary for that time period, and that's the beautiful thing. I keep going back to this, guys. This is the essence of it all, right? Is the head table. It's the place and space where we get to, identify these things. And it's such a beautiful tapestry, right? When I think about, like you said, you had both sides. You had the aspirational and the, we could argue maybe only 20-30% of our population during that time was experiencing a life like the Huxtables, right? The rest were experiencing, we run the gamut, but at the same time, for a show like that to be so widespread, like you say, there were people that argue it wasn't representative of a large part of the black experience, but it was necessary. You know what I mean? We didn't see ourselves as doctors and lawyers, right? We didn't see ourselves as en masse. You know what I'm saying? A few of us who had, parents who were doing exceptionally well and all of that, but en masse within the black culture, black American culture, we did not see that. So it was necessary to see that. It was necessary for people like you and I who grew up during the different world time period to see that. I had not seen, I was thankful. My parents, they shared their story, a meeting in college, all of that, right? And their experience in college. But that was it. I saw pictures, right? But I didn't see it live. I didn't see people that look like me, right? I'm still looking at my parents like they old, man. So to see Dwayne Wayne, right? To see these are people that are your age group, you can connect with. So it was a necessary part of that experience. And like you say, it evolved. And I think that's a big part of this tapestry, is recognizing that we're going to open this floor up for debate. We want to hear you guys say, hell no, this was stupid, right? The Cosby Show was dumb. I hated it, whatever. We want to hear all of that. But as far as us being the kind of leaders of the conversation, I think we'll always kind of our goal is to help you to understand how all of these things were necessary and how we can utilize all of these experiences, right? And instead of looking at it from a negative perspective, we change the narrative.
That's it,
right? We change the narrative,
and that's where I wanted to end the conversation, or at least right now, right? Because obviously but that's a good way to summarize. And that's why I asked the question, because that's that literally, as we do this show for as ever long we do it, that is always going to be the road that we walk down, right? This idea that we set the characteristics, right? Yep. We talked about authenticity, right? We talked about the idea of freedom, right? We talked about this idea of progression, revolution. And how do we balance that, right? With like what we want to, where we want to go, and the importance of the greatness of that, and then what's the reality of where we are right now, and how do we balance those two? And there's good in both, as Phil just walked through, right? That's going to be, when we talk about any subject, whether we talk about an album, an artist, a TV show, a movie, a fashion movement, if we bring guests onto the show and we interview, that's what we're going to talk about, because that's what we feel is missing, right? Yeah. How do we add some structure and some learning and some longevity, if you will, to that discussion, right? It's not a quick thing. It's not over. We may talk about it being this defined period, but everything that happened in those 20 years are still going on and impacting culture to this day. Yes. Those people are still here, right? A lot of those people are still making culture now, right? We talked about that, about Nas and things that he's doing today, and like how he's still moving and changing the world just like he was back in the 90s, right? So I say that to say that sort of friction between authenticity, freedom, aspiration, reality, self-expression. That's what we're going to explore in a way that hopefully I don't think you've ever seen before. And so we want you to participate. We obviously are going to participate, and that's going to set the foundation for everything that we do from this point forward.
And on that note, we thank y'all for joining us today. We're excited every time we get the opportunity to share these things that are close to our heart, and we know is close to your heart, because these things matter, right? And we just want to be a part of the conversation, and we feel truly blessed to be able to lead the conversation at the head table. So we thank you guys for coming out, and we appreciate everything that is coming out of this, and we ask you to come join us on this journey.
That's it. Have a great one. See you the next time. That one had I was feeling like, where we at? Yeah, I was feeling